How to Stay Invisible, Chapter 4. After school, Raymond made his way back to the tree where he had slept the night before. He found the duffel bag easily enough, but Rosie was nowhere in sight. "Rosie," he called, trying to keep his voice low. "Rosie, come here, girl." He looked around and saw nothing but trees and leaves. He began to panic. "Rosie!" he screamed. Then he saw her. She was standing about 50 feet from him in the woods, wagging her tail. Raymond relaxed. "Where'd you go?" he asked as she jogged to meet him. He pulled a half-eaten waffle out of his pocket and gave it to her. She ate it in one bite. Then she turned back in the direction she had come, waiting for Raymond to follow. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder and grabbed the fishing pole. He followed her into the woods for about a half a mile. She was running along in front of him, and he had to jog to keep up with her. Rosie's short legs made it much easier for her to wriggle under the brush while Raymond's pants and coat kept catching on briars. He pulled himself free and asked, "Where are we going, girl?" When he looked up, Rosie was standing inside of an enormous fallen tree. The roots of the tree had been ripped from the earth and reached out in all directions like a giant sunburst in the woods. The tree's trunk was completely hollowed out. Raymond stood at the base of the tree and peered inside. Rosie licked his hand, impatient for praise. He leaned in and scratched her ears. "Good girl," he told her. He walked around the base of the tree looking for signs of life. Rosie jumped down to follow. Raymond had heard once that fallen trees had been known to spring back upright after a storm, but the root plate of this tree appeared to be totally severed from the earth. Its trunk was sunk into the ground so that it was hard to tell where the tree stopped and the earth began. Raymond didn't think even gale force winds could budge this monster. When he was satisfied with its safety, he slung his duffel into the great hollow trunk and crawled in after it. He ducked to avoid hitting his head. The tree didn't falter. Raymond swept out the rot and leaves with his hands, revealing smooth walls. The hollowed inside of the tree was just long enough to lay his fishing pole down in. He peered outside the tree. This was as good a camp as any, he thought. At least until he could figure something else out. A cold breeze blew in and Raymond pulled his coat tight. He looked out into the quiet woods. He shifted his weight and sat down, leaning against the inside of the trunk. Without realizing it, he began to cry. Silent tears poured from his face and onto his jeans, making a splattered pattern. Rosie jumped in and lay down beside him, resting her head on his leg. After a few minutes, he pulled himself together. He opened the blue duffel and started removing the contents. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 t-shirts, 1 dirty, 2 clean, a few balled up pairs of socks and underwear, 1 gray hoodie, a toothbrush, and 1 small tackle box. He popped the top of the tackle box and thumbed through his small collection of lures. He took out the small fishing knife and then closed the box and packed everything back into the duffel, setting it by his fishing pole. Another breeze blew in and Raymond shivered. His first task was to stay warm. He needed to build a fire. He and Rosie spent the rest of the afternoon gathering small twigs and sticks. Raymond pulled off loose tree bark and threw it onto the wood pile. They found a small creek not far from the hollow tree, and Rosie drank from its waters. Feeling parched, Raymond cupped his hands to drink from the cool moving waters. He knew he should boil the water before drinking, but he needed fire first and something to boil the water in. They followed the small creek to the river, and Raymond gathered fist-sized rocks to construct a fire ring. When the sun began to set, he and Rosie made their way back to the camp. Raymond had spent his fair share of time in the woods before now. It was where he often found refuge from his parents on particularly bad nights. Sometimes when he got home from school, if his parents weren't home yet, Raymond would make himself dinner from whatever he could find in the house. and then he and Rosie would go to the woods to camp out. It was easier to choose to be alone rather than have someone force it on you. And being alone was something Raymond was used to. When Raymond lived at the children's home, kids weren't allowed to leave once they were in for the night. He had longed for the woods and the fresh air. Raymond couldn't even open the window next to his bed while he was there because it had been painted shut. Walking out of that building for the last time had been like coming up for air. He sat down by the pile of sticks. Raymond had been building fire since elementary school, but he usually had a lighter or a box of matches to help out. Now, he used his fishing knife to strip the fibers from the inside of a piece of tree bark. This he rolled between his fingers, forming a ball that would serve as loose tinder. He knew he would only have a finite amount of time to catch the tiny flame of the gum wrapper, and he needed something dry and extra flammable. He cleared an area of ground near the base of his tree shelter and crouched down to work. He constructed a fire ring with the river rocks. In the middle of the ring, he built a teepee out of twigs and left a small opening. Then he placed the larger sticks around the edge. He pulled the battery and gum pack from his pocket and unwrapped a piece, carefully using his knife to cut the wrapper into 4 strips. He calculated that he could build 20 fires using the pack of gum. But he was new at this method, and it took all 4 strips and 1 more from another wrapper to get the flame to ignite the tinder. When it finally did, he stuffed the tinder into the teepee and blew onto the twigs until they caught. Then he sat back to admire his work, feeling rather proud of himself. "I can do this," he thought. His stomach growled, and he thought of the Thanksgiving groceries and wondered if they were still in the trailer refrigerator. He guessed that they would have been cleaned out for the next tenant. What a waste. Last Thanksgiving, they had been living in a tiny studio apartment. Raymond had been couponing for weeks and had purchased 2 large chicken breasts and fried them in oil. He heated green beans from a can, and he had even boiled potatoes and tried to mash them himself. His parents had eaten the meal in silence, taking small bites like they were nervous or something. His father kept looking at the TV. Out of nowhere, his mother slammed her fork on the table. "What is this?" she asked angrily. "Are you trying to show me what a bad mom I am, huh? I can't even prepare Thanksgiving for you?" Raymond was shocked. "What? He couldn't answer. He thought they would be happy about the meal. "I could fix it if I wanted to," she said, and she lifted a spoonful of mashed potatoes and thunked it back into the pan. Then she pushed the chair back and got up. His father mimicked the action, ready to leave. His father was always ready to leave. Raymond sat at the table while they pulled on coats and boots, muttering and complaining as they left the apartment. He consolidated the food from his parents' plate onto one and set it on the floor for Rosie. She did a little jump before licking it clean. He finished his own dinner and put away the leftovers. He made Jell-O too, and he stood at the counter eating straight from the bowl. He washed the dishes, and he and Rosie left the apartment for the woods. Happy Thanksgiving. Now, Raymond poked the fire with a stick and wondered what it would be like if his parents were here. The thought almost made him laugh out loud. But his smile quickly disappeared, and he felt a growing lump in the back of his throat. He swallowed hard, pushing it back down. He stood and shook his head, taking slow, shaky breaths. His parents weren't there. He was alone. Rosie nudged his leg, and he bent and rubbed her head. Almost alone. It was a cold night, but the fire would make it bearable. Raymond wondered what he would do when the temperatures really dropped. North Carolina would probably never get as cold as Maryland, but he would need more than just his winter coat and a few twigs and leaves to keep warm. Raymond shared the half sandwich from his lunch with Rosie and ate the leftover banana. It didn't touch his hunger. His stomach growled in earnest, trying to ignore it. Raymond grabbed his toothbrush and walked back to the creek to wash up. He cleaned himself up, splashing water on his face. He took a few sips and made a mental note to find some soap. In the darkness, the shelter of the tree was oddly comforting. Rosie jumped in and Raymond lay down and used the duffel as a pillow. He thought about all the places he had lived and all the schools he had attended. There were too many to count. He thought about all the times he had slept in the woods. This felt different somehow. At the end of elementary school, Raymond's class had gone on a field trip to a wilderness camp. They had spent the day learning how to build a fire, how to set a snare to catch a rabbit, and how to build a trap for small game like mice or squirrels. They even learned which bugs could be eaten in an emergency situation. Raymond shuddered. He hoped he wouldn't need that information. Raymond shivered and tried to tuck his knees into the bottom of his coat. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote began to howl. Rosie curled up closer and he wrapped an arm around her. He listened nervously to the distant, high-pitched yelps and yowls until his eyelids became heavy and he drifted off to sleep.